South Africa's official unemployment rate increased to 25.5% in the third quarter. The International Monetary Fund cut the country's growth forecast to 1.4% this year and just 1.3% in 2016. And among other problems, business confidence is the lowest we've seen in about 22 years. And on our panel today to discuss how we can fix South Africa is lead economist and researcher at Nacsence Research Insights, that's Xhanti Payi, Stephen Meintjes, an analyst at Momentum SP Reid, and of course he's also the co-author of Our Land, Our Rent and Our Jobs. I suppose the question is, gentlemen, where do we even start? We've got about 15 minutes to try and fix South Africa and share these ideas. Xhanti, let me start with you. Before we get into what needs, we actually maybe need to start with what we need to fix first. So what are the pressing issues that we need to start dealing with?
Look, I think there's no one solution. There's the myriad of things. I think perhaps one of the interesting things about South Africa is the idea that we keep moving to sort of short-term solutions. And we haven't had the time, and taken the time at least, to sort of say, look, these are the key things that we need to fix that are much broader. So one of the things that the NDP has done is to actually sort of give us an outside plan around the key issues, starting from education, creating the skill set, to making sure that we focus on the right kinds of sectors given the kind of labor dynamics that we've got. And then at the same time also look at the outside environment and how we can actually fix some of those relationships, whether we talk about South African regional trade, or we talk about our relationships, for example, with countries like the US, China, Brazil, and those kinds of things, and what kind of lessons that we've learned. So there are a couple of things that we need to do, and obviously think about all the key things. I mean, one of the interesting things in South Africa is around this idea of our currency, right? A lot of people complain about the currency, but it's the one part where we think least about how do we actually make sure, that we find a solution around the currency that is so volatile and is so disruptive in terms of, manufacturing and certainly exports, which is a key part of our economy.
Yeah. Stephen, let's hear from you. What do you think we need to tackle first? I know you've got some interesting ideas around land reform, but anyway, let's hear from you.
Well, I think that the first thing to do is to try and break out of the cycle of mutual incomprehension between the private sector and the public sector. The public sector, as the more unemployment increases, the more the cries go for more state intervention, and of course the louder the cries from the public sector for deregulation and privatization. So no one's really listening to each other. And I think one way to break the cycle is to dig a little bit deeper, because we've had a lot of very good suggestions, in fact, in today's Fin Week. But I think we need to dig deeper, and that means you get back to land, which is not only a socio-political time bomb, if you like, but it, funnily enough, can actually provide the answer to our economic problems. And if we address the land problem, we're faced with the question, how do you divide 122 million hectares between 52 million people? Well, I'll have my 2 hectares just next door to you here, this nice piece of land that Sasol's building its headquarters on, and maybe you'd like that 2 hectares out in the Northern Cape somewhere. That's about a differential in land value of 1 million times. So this is where the money is in the urban areas. And if we switch from taxing people for investing and working to collection instead of land rental, then we have an enormously incentivizing way of generating economic growth, because you incentivize to use land efficiently, and by the same token, there are vast areas of our country which cannot cope with the tax burdens that they face, like VAT and petrol tax. And if you start a business out there, you have to pay for your this PAYE and so on and so forth. And in fact, right next to our mining areas, the problem is you can't start businesses there because of tax. So where land values are very low, then it'll be a huge stimulus to business, because they won't be paying as much in land rentals as they are in tax. So it's a different way of going about it, and can be done by subtle change. Because, by the way, at the socio-political level, you have now ensured that everybody in South Africa benefits from his or her land, because the rent or locational advantage of every piece of land is being collected by the community, which creates the value.
So as you've heard from Stephen, Xhanti, he says that the answer could possibly be looking at land. There's been this huge issue around transformation, and we are talking about land. Is there a way that we could do this effectively? Can we talk about transformation and economic progress in the same sentence?
They must go together. I think it's a critical question. And land is an important thing. One of the interesting things about what Stephen is saying is the way in which we think about solutions in South Africa, because we are stuck in our own interests. So the idea about how we think about land and transformation becomes very emotional, and then people don't want to think creatively and more openly around the solutions for everybody, what is at the best interest of everyone else. And I think the land question has been that emotional. But certainly we realize in this country that one of the problems around the land issue is also the historical issue, not so much about transferring it from black people to white people, but who owns it even within the black people. So one of the interesting things that we find, for example, the rural structures, they've just brought out a land around how do you manage rural land. Is it given to the chief, in terms of traditional? So the traditional bill says, that it will be owned by the chief or the community, which means that it makes it very difficult for some people to develop it. Women having access, for example, to use that land, to plant, to use it also as security, all the kinds of things that, a piece of land allows you to do, whether you're going to actually give it to somebody else who wants to rent it, a business that wants to come and rent your piece of land, and you can get some rentals, and then you can use that money in another productive activity. These things are very, very important, but we haven't found ways where we are actually wide open in terms of the new creative solutions that we can to create. And that doesn't only stop with land. It actually goes through every other sector in terms of how do we think in South Africa. Some of the things, the issues around mining. People have been saying, well, a lot of people say, yeah, beneficiation. It's an important discussion, but people say, but we'll never be able to do that because how do we do that? We don't have the base. We're never going to create the base because nobody actually thinks we can. So these are some of the problems that we have around how do we discuss issues in this country so that we actually have new creative ways. And we ask our best thinkers to come up with solutions to say this could work if we did it this way, and then be open to that listening. But it does also emanate to how we don't hear each other. So business does speak from their own corner, government speaks from their own corner, and they never meet each other. There's that distrust. Part of it is historical, but part of it also is quite new in terms of actually the interests even within the government sector of what can be gained and what can't be gained politically in terms of the advantages that people gain if they choose certain policies. Yes. So this is a very difficult thing to overcome, but it probably starts there. How do we hear each other in terms of what we need to do for the country? Because it is for of mutual benefit.
Are we listening to each other, Stephen? There are so many indabas that you hear about in every sector. There's a conference, there's an indaba, there's a networking session. There's always something. So we've got all these indabas. One would think that we are really listening to each other.
Well, that's right. We need to listen to each other. And I mean, Mark Wayne at the Redefined presentation yesterday had a lot of very interesting suggestions. But as I say, I think we need to dig deeper. We need to have a land indaba, if you like, because what is being proposed here is completely different from what left and right are proposing at the moment. And it's something where you can get a coalition of interest. It is so different, so new and so fresh, and yet very old. I mean, look at Hong Kong. There's a book published recently on explaining exactly how Hong Kong finances itself to a very large extent from land. And that is one of the reasons why it's been so famously successful. When Milton Friedman held it up as an example of free enterprise, he omitted to mention that one of the reasons was they were actually getting most of their state revenue from land. And a very similar situation applies in Singapore as well.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, we won't be able to take this discussion further, but I think I've been able to hear we need to listen to each other. Some of the solutions stem from land and simple things that we could do, or low-hanging fruit, as people like to talk. These are some of the things that we can do to try and fix South Africa. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing your insights and your ideas. Thanks to the lead economist and researcher at Nacsence Research Insights. That is Xhanti Payi, Stephen Meintjes, an analyst at Momentum SP, and author. He's also the author of that particular book that is called Our Land, Our Rent and Our Jobs.